have forgotten last class. There we go. So let's get started with World War II's combat. First key point. So Americans will view this war, guys, as a survival for freedom and democracy against the fascist and militaristic ideologies of the Axis powers. This perspective of like, hey, we're fighting for freedom, we're fighting for liberty, will be reinforced when people realize the type of wartime atrocities that the Japanese were doing and that the Nazis were doing with concentration camps and the Holocaust. So we think it's a fight for survival of democracy, and it is. We just don't know it yet until post-war, right? Until late in the war when we're figuring all this stuff out. Right? We talked about a lot of those atrocities, particularly the Japanese ones earlier, because a lot of the Holocaust and stuff, we'll talk about it tomorrow when we talk about post-war, because that's more when that was happening. A lot of the Japanese stuff's happening from the beginning on. Like, they're not hiding what they're doing. I'll give you a quick minute for the key points, and then we'll move forward. All right, about 10 more seconds. If you need more time, please grab a screenshot. We're going to move forward. All right. So, okay, America's strategy in this war. So first of all, the United States is fighting a two-front war, which means we're fighting in the Pacific. We're also fighting in the Atlantic, right? Those are the two theaters of war we will fight in. The primary focus of the United States and the Allies will be on defeating Europe, defeating Germany. Victory in Europe will be closing the ring on Japan. Once you defeat Germany, there is no one really to help them out. They are on their own. The Pacific Fleet, which is freshly repaired post-Pearl Harbor attack, will be tasked with containing the Japanese. Do not let them spread out any further. Contain them. And then, of course, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is just like, hey, this general's in charge of the army. This general's in charge. Like, they are established. The different leaders who are in charge of different branches of the army, of the military. Just a note of how much the American forces will increase in size. In 1939, there's only 189 American soldiers in the army. In 1942, there will be 3,075,608. Similar to the Navy, 125,000 in 39, 640,000 in 1942. So a few years later, right as the invasions are getting ready to take place, the numbers, like, you know, in the army, what's that, like 30 times increase? It's pretty intense. So just to keep that in mind. Again, quick minute on this. It's stuff that you should already have in there. Go quick minute and a half. And then we'll start getting into some of the fighting. And we're going to focus first on talking about the Atlantic, and then we'll talk about the fighting in the Pacific. And I can't stress enough, since this is mostly just quick terms and definitions today. If you guys have questions, whether it's about the war, about anything, just ask them. You can send them privately. Just ask them, and I'll answer them as best as I can. About 30 seconds, guys, and then we're going to move on and start talking about the Phoney War and the Battle of Britain. All right, getting ready to move forward. So In the Atlantic Theater in 39, Hitler invades Poland. Bam, everybody declares war on each other. And then in September, nothing happens. All the armies kind of mobilize, get ready, but nothing seems to be happening. This era is known as the Phony War. The Phony War will come to an end when Germany begins blitzkrieg invading southern France. So blitzkrieg, guys, I know you guys have probably heard that term, right? Lightning War, blitzkrieg, but it's a unique strategy, and it's a German innovation, and it's a really powerful tool tactically that the Germans use when they go on the offensive. But it relies on two things. It relies on tanks and armored divisions, and it relies on air superiority. So the way the Germans did blitzkrieg was they would use their aircraft, their Luftwaffe, to gain air superiority, which over France was very easy because the French Air Force was not great. And then they would use the Stuka dive bombers, which were very accurate, deadly accurate. And with air superiority, they're not under threat because the only way you can take out really a dive bomber effectively is with fighter planes. And when you don't have fighter planes in the sky, you can't take out dive bombers. So the dive bombers are blowing up everything they want. So what they would do is they would attack the Allied lines, right? So French line up their troops all ready to go. And then these dive bombers start coming out of the sky and blowing holes in the lines of troops, right? And then with those blasts, tanks rush through the holes. Does that make sense? So aircraft damage and destroy parts of the enemy line, and then tanks rush through those parts and get behind the enemy. Does that make sense, guys? Quick yes or no? That's blitzkrieg. And it's something no one really knew how to fight, how to handle, how to fight against. It's not until allies start to gain air superiority late in the war, like the British and the Americans, that blitzkrieg doesn't really work anymore. You know what I mean? Like that's until then, when the Germans are attacking early on and no one realizes how important aircraft are and nobody's using them in the same way, except for the British, but we'll get to that in a second. It's impossible. It's crazy. So that's blitzkrieg. With blitzkrieg, Germany's able to knock France out of the war in a month, very quickly. The British army, which is on the ground in France, the way they were in the First World War, has to run and retreat for their lives. They make it to this little town, Dunkirk. There's a movie. I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen it. The movie's pretty accurate. Basically, the British army is surrounded by Germans, and with help from the French, which are still there helping, fighting. Some of those French soldiers are fighting really hard, keeping the Germans at bay for a couple of days, while Churchill calls for every vessel that floats, right? And it's fishing boats, yachts, random weekend boats, like everything you can think of that was in England that could float, which is a lot. England has a lot of boats, sailed across the channel, ferried back troops for days, all the time, round the clock, despite being attacked by the Luftwaffe, despite some defense from the RAF, but the RAF isn't really helping. Like they're helping as much as they can, but the RAF has to worry about conserving planes for defending mainland England. So it's what keeps Britain in the war. Britain saves their army. Their army was about to be destroyed. This maintains it. The Dunkirk escape, which isn't on here, but it's just something to point out. Dunkirk army is saved because they managed to get away, right? The thing we are going to talk about is the Battle of Britain. This is a series of aerial battles between the RAF, which are the British RAF, and the German Luftwaffe. Germany, right after they beat France, right after the British army escapes, is like, all right, let's invade Britain now because Britain doesn't want to surrender. And they have this plan called Operation Sea Lion. It's this whole plan that never gets to, sorry, I'm talking too fast. It is a plan to invade mainland Britain, right? It has three parts. First part, control the skies over the English Channel and over England, destroy the RAF essentially. Second part, control the English Channel with your navy. Third part, invade the mainland. Well, it never gets past the first part for two reasons. One, radar. The British have radar and they use it. They have this early warning system set up that pings these German planes when they're about to get to England. And when it pings them, they call on the RAF. And the RAF fighter command sends planes up to go meet and combat these German bombers. And early on, the Battle of Britain's all about who's can destroy whose air force first. And the Luftwaffe looks like they're about to completely ruin the RAF. The RAF are down to like 2 or 3 bases. It gets really rough. But because of a British retaliation, which they bomb Berlin, the Germans start bombing London instead. And the RAF is able to recoup their strength. And so something you got to know about the aircraft battles in this time period is that total war is in full effect. And what total war means now, it's not burning down plantations, it's bombing cities with civilians in them. And all the sides do this. Both sides do it. The Germans do it. The Japanese do it. The British do it. The Americans do it. Everybody does it. Nobody's hands are clean in this. And the whole point of it is bomb the civilians, bomb the cities, make people want to give up. Does that make sense? So total war is engulfing Europe entirely. But again, both sides do it. The British bomb Berlin. Okay, so the Germans bomb London. And a lot of the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, the German Blitz, or as it's known, or the German bombing of London, it was all just about defending London and maintaining air superiority. And because the Germans start bombing London instead of RAF bases, the RAF guys right here, I'm not kidding, guys. It'd be like, hey, we're sitting there, right? They're sitting there hanging out. And then alarm goes off, like fire department almost, right? And then they're like, all right, and they get up, they run to their planes, and they get in the sky and they go fight Germans. And this happened for weeks. This is a weeks-long series of dogfights and skirmishes in the skies over and over and over again. Spitfires like these, Hawker Hurricanes like the ones on the other picture. These guys are heroes. They saved England. They saved World War II, you could argue, because if Britain falls early, who knows what happens. And Britain was on their knees. And it's the RAF that keeps them off of it and keeps them engaged and keeps them winning that conflict. Without the RAF, it's hard to say if they would have won or not. Actually, it's not that hard. They would have lost. So that's the Battle of Britain. Again, fighter pilots defending England from the German Luftwaffe and managing to do it fairly successful. It's a dangerous job, by the way. Not easy. Not an easy job for sure. I'm trying to remember. There's a Churchill quote. Give you a few seconds here just to fill in the. All you need for this slide, by the way, is the change in bombing styles. The fact that now it's okay to bomb civilians in World War II. It's a thing everybody does. But there's a Churchill quote I'm trying to remember where he says, like, never before in the struggles of man have so many owed so much to so few. And he's talking about these fighter pilots because they save England. And it's not a whole army. It's probably a couple of hundred guys that are just, oh, they shot me down. Let me get in another plane. Let me go again, right? If they make it out, stuff like that. I don't have the figures because again, this isn't like this was an English history course. We'd probably spend a whole day just talking about this battle alone, talking about the general stuff, but it really isn't. But I just think it's really important to point it out. So Battle of Britain's happening. The Battle of Britain kind of subsides, and now it's just more steady, right? Of fighter command ready to go defend England. And then for reasons we're about to talk about, Germany kind of forgets about England and moves on. But once Pearl Harbor happens and the United States enters the war, they enter in a big way. The first thing they do to get into Europe to start fighting, and this is early, this is in 1941, this is right after Pearl Harbor, they start sending bomber groups to help attack the Germans, I'm sorry. So basically what happens is the Americans will send the 8th Air Force, the Army Air Corps, right? And that's bomber command, fighter command, everything they got. And it goes into England. There's all these old isolated bases in England. I think I mentioned them the other day, right? That are still around and that are still very well respected because these Americans are the first Americans fighting in the war, and they're fighting to defend England. They're helping out England essentially. And these are all B-17s because that's what most of them use. The B-24s come way later and they're not really used as much. But these B-17 crews, it's a dangerous job up there in those planes. It's like freezing cold. It's like sub-zero temperatures in there. And they wore these electric heating suits that tended to electrocute them and not really heat them all that well. You could get hypothermia and frostbite from just being in that plane and not wearing all of your layers that they needed to wear. That's why they wear those big old jackets, by the way, because it's so cold up there. There's no insulation on the planes yet. Not to mention that, but it's just a dangerous job in general. There's no like fighter escorts, by the way. These bombers go out there by themselves and they're kind of exposed to German fighters, which happened all the time. But they are like the Masters of Air. That's a book about them. It's really good. But basically, yeah, B-17 crews, first Americans fighting in the war. It's something to point out, right? B-17 crews that are doing strategic bombing, basically. The B-17 crews have to bomb during the daytime, which is another thing that they're bombing during the day, the Americans, and then the British are bombing at night. So that way the bombing never stops. But it exposes a lot of the American troops to more. Like these are some of the 92nd bomb group planes. I think that's 381st bomb group, like all these different squadrons. It's pretty cool. So that's America's early contributions in Europe. But a big part of why they're able to do this also is that the Battle of Britain's over. Why is the Battle of Britain over? well, the Battle of Britain is over because the Atlantic theater will open up on the Eastern Front, basically meaning that Hitler's going to get a little bored. He's not able to invade Britain the way he wants to, so he's going to invade the Soviet Union instead. Operation Barbarossa takes hold, which is Germany's plan to invade the Soviet Union. He wants to capture the main cities of Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad. The Soviet Union holds them back and turns the tide at the Battle of Stalingrad, where the Soviets will push back the German armies and make them start surrendering. And once the Battle of Stalingrad is over, the German forces in the Soviet Union are going to be pushed back all the way into Germany. Part of why that's a failure is a couple of reasons. Mainly it's tactical errors. By this point, Hitler's in charge of the German army and he's leading them and refusing to let them retreat and stuff. A lot of these German generals. So we're going to move forward. Again, just define these. I'll give you a quick 30 seconds and then I'll talk about it more. Sorry, guys. I'm just kind of blabbing away. Not giving you time to write. I apologize. Give you a quick 45 seconds. And then we'll talk about what's going on and why Stalingrad is such a turning point. I'll show you some cool pictures from it. But again, it's not a lot of note writing today. It's just more like, hey, what are the turning points in the war? You don't need to write too many notes. I would point out the stuff about the American bomb groups because, again, this is U.S. history. It's good to know. And it's a major U.S. contribution in the war. About 45 seconds. All right, so let's go ahead and move forward. Okay, so again, Battle of Stalingrad. These are some images from Stalingrad. Some of these are already some of the modern, more colorized ones, right, where they take them later and colorize them as a Soviet sniper, a couple of Soviet troops. This is a Soviet T-34 tank, and then these are some German troops advancing. I actually think these are Soviets now that I think about it, but these are German troops. So something to point out. German armies early on in Barbarossa are winning, and they're taking, but the winter hits. When the winter hits, the armies halt. They stop. It gets really, really dangerous for them, and a lot of their tanks are freezing and stuff, but the Soviet tanks don't do that because, they're used to the winter, and the Soviets are using the winter to their advantage. Battle of Stalingrad and a few other key defeats for the Germans. Part of why it happens, a lot of people will say, is that Hitler refuses to let his armies retreat, and because of that, the armies will be cut off, isolated, surrounded, and destroyed instead of being able to retreat and come together and try to make an offensive. Just something to point out. Not like I'm here trying to say oh, poor German army, right? But it's what happens. A lot of it is these are veteran armies that are really capable and that did a lot of fighting in the Soviet Union, and they're surrounded and destroyed because of their leadership. And Hitler is crazy. So something to keep in mind. So all you really need here, you don't need to write all these down. I would write the Battle of El Alamein, which is where the British defeat Erwin Rommel for the first time. It's a major defeat of Rommel in 42, and Operation Torch, which is where the Western Front opens up in the North Africa campaign because the United States invades. And then Operation Avalanche, which is the invasion of Italy. Sorry. So I'd write those three down. I wouldn't worry about Dragoon. Dragoon is another Italy thing, where they come in through Tunisia. I think Avalanche is Sicily, and then Tunisia is the other one. But it's not important. All you need is that. There is fighting in Africa. I'll show you some images of that in a second. Give you a quick minute. I would only write down El Alamein and Operation Torch. Yeah, you only need that. It's quick, brief stuff. You don't need too much. All right, let's go ahead and move forward. If you need more time, let me know. So some images. Again, this is one of those colorized of, these are German troops under Rommel. This is Erwin Rommel. I always say his name wrong. The Afrika Korps, right? The very famous Afrika Korps that beat up a bunch of British armies all the way through until Montgomery gets there. This is them surrendering to some British troops post defeat. And then these are some images of British troops fighting in Africa. And then these are some American troops fighting in Africa. It's a machine gun group, I believe. Just cool stuff. I like looking at all these, old pictures. So we invade Africa. We fight there, kick Rommel out. We invade Italy. There is harsh fighting in Italy, right? Italy is where a lot of Americans are going to die in Italy, but because Germans are defending it, Italians aren't. The Italians are going to get knocked out of this war very quickly. But the reason there's so much fierce fighting in Italy is because of German troops in Italy. But after a few years, after two practice invasions, being the invasion of Africa and the invasion of Italy, the Allies will invade mainland Europe and France. So they will, the D-Day invasion, right? Operation Overlord, as it's known. June 6, 1944 is the D-Day invasion. By August, we have liberated Paris, but in December, the winter, later on, there is the Battle of the Bulge, which is one of the last major German offenses and German attempts to break through Allied lines and really defeat the Allies and send them packing and send them away. It doesn't work. It comes close to working a couple of places, but it does not work. The Allies hold off the attack, especially like there's groups of like paratroopers, for example, that'll be cut off. I don't have a Battle of the Bulge map up here. I probably should have put one, but that are cut off and stuff. And it just doesn't, it's harsh fighting, but the Allies are victorious. The Russians and the Americans will meet at the Elbe River in April of 45. And then late April in 45, Hitler will commit suicide and bring the war in Europe pretty much to an end. So I'll give you a quick 2 minutes. I want you to point out the D-Day, the date for D-Day, the date and what the Battle of the Bulge is, and then Hitler's suicide date. Actually, you don't need 2 minutes. We'll do about a minute and a half. It's just really brief. These are the main points of the, what would you say, Western Front. Part 2. The Hitler suicide. Yes, the Hitler suicide was real. He took cyanide and shot himself in the face. Then he had his aides burn his body and destroy the ashes because he didn't want to be paraded around victoriously the way like Mussolini was. Like Mussolini was hung and like they paraded his body around and were like, haha, we killed the fascists, like all the Italians and stuff. But he didn't want that to happen to him. So he committed suicide, he shot himself, and he ordered his subordinates to incinerate his remains and his wife's remains and make sure he was incinerated. Like they threw him in there and cooked him really good till there was nothing left. Plus, the Soviets were in Berlin and he was scared of the Soviets. Rightfully so. Soviets would have messed him up really bad. Like a lot of German troops are looking for British and Americans to surrender to because they treated the Soviets really badly and the Soviets were in return treating them really badly. So that's a thing that's going to be an issue. And we'll talk about it post-war, and it's gonna be what helps lead to the Cold War. Actually, that's about time. Let's go ahead and move forward. Let's talk about some pictures. So D-Day invasion, I'm sure you guys have seen clips from movies and stuff of the D-Day invasion, the landing vessels, the beach landings, paratroopers flying in the night before, jumping into the middle of France and having different objectives to capture and make the beach landing a little easier. Very heroic stuff that everybody participated in. But yeah, I mean, guys, a lot of this stuff is really well covered. And again, you don't really need to get into the nitty gritty of military strategy and effectiveness, but it's fun to kind of just point it out, you know? If you guys have any questions, ask them along the way. These are some images from the Bulge, the Battle of the Bulge. Winter, snow, trench foot comes back, hypothermia comes back in a big way. And these guys are just buried in foxholes in the snow. Very little tank support. There's some images of tanks here, all covered in snow, but there's very little support from them. And it's last time that the Germans attack, and they attack harsh. And then these are near Germany, these defenses post Battle of the Bulge here. But so yeah, some cool images. They would hide in the tree lines and just kind of pop, and like wait for tanks to roll up and try to deal with it. It's really rough. Band of Brothers does a really good job of depicting the Battle of the Bulge, actually. Probably one of the best ones that I've seen. Yeah. Okay, so let's move forward. Let's talk about the Pacific. So early on, Pearl Harbor happens. Bam. Then the Japanese start attacking islands. They attack the Philippines, and they will capture the Philippines. Bataan, the Bataan Death March, where a bunch of American POWs are killed on the way to their POW camp, where more will die in that camp because the Japanese treat their civilians, their POWs, I'm sorry, horribly, harshly. It's another war crime they do. No, Donovan, I believe that is World War I. So Americans are going to suffer massive defeats in the Philippines, the army. There will be an American surrender, and some like leaders will be evacuated. Douglas MacArthur's among them. We'll talk about MacArthur in a second. So enter Admiral Chester Nimitz, who leads the American Navy and the Pacific Fleet against the Japanese. Battle of the Coral Sea. The Americans claim this as a victory. This is really a draw. This is the Americans not losing. So they take it as a victory, kind of like in what's the other battle that they do that a couple of times, right? Americans love to do that. So it's they did with the War of 1812. It's not a full victory, but it's the Americans not losing, so they claim the victory. It's a draw. But it's the first major engagement between aircraft carriers. So one of the big technological innovations, and you want to write this in, is that naval combat is done with aircraft carriers now. It's not done with battleships. Battleships don't do it anymore. It's all about aircraft carriers. It's all about, can your planes sink their ships before their planes sink your ships? That's what the fighting is. So that being said, you get the Battle of Midway, June 1942. This is a major turning point in the Pacific theater because the Americans are going to score one of the biggest naval victories in American military history. Japan will lose all 4 of its aircraft carriers in one day at this one battle. They will be destroyed by American dive bombers. This is a turning point in the Pacific theater because now that fleet, whose job is to contain the Japanese, are going to have a much easier time of doing that because now the Japanese fleet is kind of defenseless. They cannot no longer maintain air superiority in the skies because they don't have any more aircraft carriers. And because of that, they no longer will be able to maintain naval superiority because now American aircraft carriers can just rip apart and destroy like the Japanese fleet at any time, right? So those are the main battles. I'll give you 2 minutes for here because you need Nimitz's name. You need the Battle of Midway. You need the Coral Sea as the kind of draw at the first big fight. And just point out that the United States will lose the Philippines to the Japanese. The Japanese are going to take them. They're going to take all these little islands in the Pacific. But once the Japanese fleet is defeated, the American strategy of how to win back these islands can come into play. A little bit of time here, about a minute and change left. About 30 seconds, and then we're going to go ahead and move forward and move on. And I'll show you some images of some of the naval fighting, and we'll talk about island hopping and all that fun stuff. All right, let's go to move forward. So early defeats, these are some images from the Philippines of American and Allied forces surrendering to the Japanese Imperial Army. Here are some, I think this is actually the offensive later, but just American forces in the Philippines fighting. Naval combat. So this is what naval combat looks like now, right? You got flat guns firing air defense. You've got airplanes swarming over massive ships like bees attacking. That's what it was now. And you've got these ships almost like sitting ducks, right? Like they float, I guess, or move in these big formations. And the aircraft carriers are usually in the center, protected by the destroyers and the battleships around them and by the planes on the carrier. These are some American dive bombers, Dauntless dive bombers, and these are like the naval dive bombers. And the reason I'm pointing these out is because those are what win the Battle of Midway. So the way the Japanese, with their Zeros and their really good torpedoes, tended to sink American ships was with torpedo bombers, right? The Japanese Zeros would come in really, really, really low, and they drop a torpedo and it would destroy the ship, right? Well, American torpedo bombers, and there's no easy way to say this, so I'm going to say it, are giant flying trash cans. The planes themselves aren't that bad, but the torpedoes are. The torpedoes are, they might as well drop water bottles on them. The torpedoes don't do anything. They don't blow up when they're supposed to, and they don't do well in the water. They would drop torpedoes, and it's like, direct hit, it's awesome, and then think it would hit the ship and it would fall down. Like the American torpedo bombers are death traps because their torpedoes are useless. So American torpedo bombers are useless. At Midway, it's a really interesting thing where the torpedo bombers find the ships and they all get blown up. And these dive bombers are just floating around, flying around. And they're like, is that a ship? And they see it and they come in. And the dive bombers are really, really good. The American dive bomber crews are really good. But on top of that, the Dauntless dive bomber is just a good dive bomber. And dive bombers, I've already said, right, are deadly accurate. They're exposed, but they're really accurate. So what these dive bomber crews do is they ruin and destroy these aircraft carriers. Part of why it happens too is that the admiral, which is, I think his name is Yamamoto, forget all the Japanese admiral names. But he's in the process of deciding if he should bomb the islands or if he should attack the ships. And so he, like 2 or 3 times, he makes a decision of, hey, put bombs on the planes. No, never mind, put torpedoes. No, never mind, put bombs, right? He's doing that. And while he's trying to make that decision, and when the dive bombers find the carriers, there's bombs and torpedoes scattered all over the flight decks. Like there's munitions all over the place. They're not stored and put away in the safe, like armored, like magazines. They're all scattered across the flight deck. So when these dive bombers hit those aircraft carriers, what's going to happen to the aircraft carriers? Tell me in the chat. What do you think is going to happen with bombs and torpedoes scattered all over the place in the open? Seems pretty obvious, but I want you to tell me. They're going to bomb it, and all those bombs and all those torpedoes and all those things on those flight decks are going to blow up. And on top of that, Japanese flight decks were made of wood. They were really well made, right? They were really great for the planes taking off, but they are wooden flight decks. These dive bombers are going to wreck those flight decks. And what happens to those carriers, because all the munitions are all over the place, they will explode as if the magazines were being struck, which I don't know if I've mentioned it, right? But like when Navy ships fight, hitting the magazine, it's like 1 in a million shot. But if you hit it, the whole boat blows up, right? That's how these carriers are going to get destroyed, because munitions are going to be scattered throughout the carrier because they're transitioning from bombs to torpedo fighting because they're going to go fight carriers. But because they're doing that, he also doesn't have as many fighters defending him because he sent a bunch out to go attack the islands. It's a luck of the draw, right? Because the dive bombers just happen to find the carriers, and the Japanese carriers just happen to be less defended. And on top of that, they also happen to have bombs scattered all over the place. So it's a catastrophic failure for the Japanese. They lose all their carriers in one day. And from that point forward, the Allies have the advantage. Enter Douglas MacArthur. General Douglas MacArthur is the definition textbook of a diva general. He loves being a general. He knows he's good at it. And on top of it, he's kind of a baby sometimes. He was in charge of defending the Philippines. And when the Philippines fall, he is evacuated. But He loves the Philippines. He loves the people, and the people love him. He very famously will broadcast, "I will come back. I will return, and I will return with, like, the might of the American military, blah, blah, blah," right? "I'm going to come back to the Philippines and liberate you," is what he says. Side note, his cap, his corncob pipe, they're not regulation, like they're not official army like uniform, but he wears them anyways because he likes to look good and he doesn't care. He was also appointed the field marshal of the Philippines military, and field marshals are ranked that the American army doesn't have, but he didn't care, and he would walk around calling himself field marshal and carrying the baton that they give him anyways. He's a really interesting guy, but he will lead the army, the American military, I should say, in the land battles. He leads the land army. Nimitz leads the Navy. He leads the land army. And he will have this strategy known as island hopping, right? Because the Japanese are defended by all these little islands, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, all these little islands are just around Japan, right? And so they do this strategy called island hopping. They go from island to island, hit the island, throw everything you have at it, capture the island. Go to the next one, throw everything you have at it, capture the island. Go to the next one, throw everything you have at it, capture the island, right? And the Navy's there to contain. The Navy's on the outside containing. U.S. Marines, led by MacArthur, are taking everything else, right? This island fighting is really harsh. The Japanese military is on the defense because their fleet has been pretty much ruined and destroyed at Midway. They will face unique, cruel, and devastating attacks by the Japanese. Kamikaze attacks. You guys know what they are? Yes or no? You guys know what kamikaze attacks are? Yes, what are they? Like, what's a kamikaze attack? It's a suicide plane, right? Suicide bombers. Yeah, good. They will also do bonsai charges. And a bonsai charge is practically the same thing, but it's less effective. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be laughing. But the Japanese will put bayonets on, like if it's the Civil War, and they'll run at these American machine gun nests and positions and try to charge. Like when they're cornered, when Japanese forces are cornered, instead of like, we give up, they put on bayonets and charge American machine gun posts. It's horrifying stuff. This is like Vietnamese stuff where these, like the Americans that fought here, man, it's harsh. It is harsh. It is jungle conditions. It is rough. It is rough fighting, but the Americans will win. It is hard fought, bitter, and every step of the way, it's got to be earned. The Japanese literally fight for every single square inch of land that they have, but the Allies managed to take it from them every step of the way. Here are some images from Pacific Theater fighting. This is the flag raising at Iwo Jima. Flamethrowers are here in a big way because of all the forestation. Cooking human beings, it's a thing that a lot of these guys did. Some artillery strikes underneath. This is Iwo Jima. The volcanic, like black sand that they're in is rough terrain, to say the least. Some Marines here fighting. There's a BAR and a Thompson, some cool stuff. And then these are some of the Japanese that they were fighting against. This isn't in these islands. This is a random picture. But it's hard to find images of the Japanese because there's not a lot of like Japanese war correspondents taking really cool pictures like there are for the Allies. But just some, so you guys kind of have an idea of what it looks like. Second key point. This is a repeat key point from yesterday's lesson, so I'm not going to really read it, but just basically military service provides women and minorities a chance to like improve their position, right? Let's talk about some of the other groups in the military. So African Americans or blacks in World War II, 1.2 million will fight in the war. It's a large number, but they will still have to deal with segregation in the military. Their units will be segregated. Black officers will not be able to hold ranks over whites. The Tuskegee Airmen are worth pointing out. They are fighter and bomber pilots. They are they are the first black military aviators in the armed forces. Donovan, that's funny. So I'll give you a quick minute, talk about the Tuskegee Airmen. Make sure you point them out. Point out the numbers of African Americans that will participate in this war, and point out that they still had to deal with Jim Crow levels of segregation, even in the military. It's not till after the war that Eisenhower ends military segregation with the snap of a finger, but he does end it. But not yet, not during the war. Eisenhower will do it when he's president. About 40 seconds, 45, no, I'm sorry, minute. I was like, about a minute left. We're almost out of time, but we are making good time. We will finish right on time today, guys. Do not worry. I also think kamikaze means divine wind. That could be wrong, but just a side note. It does, right? Divine wind. Yeah. They also used to take these planes and they would put like bombs in them, like extra bombs and stuff. They would load them with explosives and powder and then crash them into stuff to try to. That's another thing they did. Or what the Japanese used to do, if they were wounded or if they were like the last guy left and everybody else was dead, like in a bonsai charge, they would take a grenade and they would hold it like they would put their finger on the pin, they would hold it and they would kind of like lay down. And then when somebody found them, they'd pull the pin and blow everybody up. They used to do that a lot too. That was a thing the Japanese used to do. All right, let's go ahead and move forward. Japanese Americans in World War II, the 442nd Infantry. Second generation Japanese Americans, one of the most decorated units in U.S. military history. And this is even though that a bunch of their relatives and friends are interred in camps in the United States. They are still out fighting. Now, they weren't allowed to fight in Japan. They fought in Europe. But the 442nd, which is an all-Japanese group, will get more than 4,000 Purple Hearts, which that's for being wounded, medals. They will receive 4,000 Bronze Stars, 8 Presidential Unit Citations, and 21 Congressional Medals of Honor will be given out to that group. To put those Medals of Honor into perspective, most of the dudes that get those are dead, like because they died doing whatever it was. They're post-mortem. So not all of them, but most of them. So this is a really, really decorated unit in the Army's history, and it's Japanese Americans fighting for their country, despite being interned. It's kind of crazy when you think about it. So I'll give you a quick, you don't need much, like 45 seconds, just the name of the unit and that they're one of the most decorated units in military history. Quick 30 seconds. And point out that they're Japanese Americans. Go for broke was their slogan, by the way. That's why it says that. Go for broke. All in. Let's do it. All right. So how about Native Americans? 44,000 Native Americans will serve in the American Armed Forces, which is a pretty good number. I love this picture, by the way, of them putting on the war. I think these are Cherokee, and they're putting on war paint before they jump out of the airplanes. Really cool stuff. And they have the Mohawks on and everything. Like back in the day, it's really awesome. Some really cool stories about a lot of these guys. There's a division, I think it's the 87th. There's a show about them on Netflix, like an animated show. It's really good. I recommend it. I think it's called Liberation or something. Where it's Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and then like white, like Texan like types of people, and they're all in the same unit. And it's really cool. And it's a true story because that's a real unit. But anyways, let's talk about natives. So on top of just fighting in the military, which a bunch of them did, there were these Navajo code talkers in the Pacific Theater, where a military code, a secret code was built based on the Navajo language. Like, for example, tortoise, tank, right? Things like that. And it used variations on their tone and syntax, and only the Navajo knew it, and they would communicate it to each other. And it was so effective that the Japanese never broke the code. To put in perspective how codes are, how it's hard to do that with a code, the Allies had broken all the Japanese codes and all the German codes. Like, we knew what the Germans were saying when they would talk to each other, right? And so we were able to do that, in part because of British intelligence, but we still did it. The Japanese never broke the Navajo codes. It stayed unbroken. We were able to secretly communicate with each other at all times. And this helped contribute to successful island hopping campaigns because the Americans can talk to each other and the Japanese have no idea what they're saying. So I'll give you a quick, again, minute and a half for this one because I do want you to point out the contributions of the Navajo and of other Native Americans to the fighting. There's a colorized version of this picture where you see them all standing there with their war paint on. It looks really awesome. The black, the red, the white, it looks really cool. They're putting on the stuff their great-grandfathers did when they would go out and fight cowboys. It's really awesome, except they're going to go fight Nazis. I love history, guys. There's so much cool stuff in there. And some of them go fight Nazis next to cowboys, which is even... I'm telling you guys, if you're bored at home, check out that show. It's like an animated show on Netflix, but it's a World War II show. It's really good. About 45 seconds. All right, let's go ahead and move forward. So Hispanics and Mexican Americans, I mean, they're not the same thing, right? Were not segregated. So they did not get segregated units. They fought mixed with everybody. And when I say everybody, I mean whites. But over 500,000 will serve in the war. I'm going to point out 2 Medal of Honor recipients, Rudolph Davila in the Western Front, and so in Europe, in the Atlantic Theater, for destroying 3 enemy machine gun positions by himself. And then Alejandro Ruiz in the Pacific Theater for destroying an enemy pillbox and killing the 12 soldiers inside by himself. Just a couple of Medal of Honor recipients that were Mexican Americans. But yeah, Mexican Americans, the thing to point out about them is that they were not segregated in their own units. So they fought alongside with whites and everybody else. They were not mixed like the African Americans were, like the Japanese Americans were. They were integrated. And you saw a lot of like tension sometimes between different people and like, you know, white officers and young Hispanics being told what to do and things like that. And it was a dynamic that as combat went on tended to fade, but not always. Quick minute on here. About 35 seconds. All right, let's go ahead and move forward. Last key points. All you need to know here, right? The U.S. and the Allies will achieve victory through military, through cooperation, technological and scientific advances, as well as the use of atomic bombs, which make the war go a lot quicker. I'll give you a quick minute on here. Actually, no, I'll just give you 30 seconds. If you need more time, please screenshot it. And then we'll move forward and we'll talk about the dropping of the bombs. We'll talk about a few technological innovations, and then we will be done. Again, if there are any questions on this or about the exit ticket a little later, just let me know on Teams. All right, let's go ahead and move forward. So technological advances, radar, sonar, V1 and V2 rockets. Radar is what helps the British defeat the Germans in the Battle of Britain and so on. The United States will get radar as well. Sonar helps defeat German submarines. Prior to this, there's no way to find them under the water, like in World War I, but now there is. V1 and V2 rockets are Germans using them for strategic bombing late in the war. Never to a great effective center, but they are able to build a bomb that flies itself, which is something that's it's scary to think about. Quick minutes. Actually, a little less than a minute on here. Let's move forward. So these are the pros and these are the cons. So the cons of dropping the bomb, right? Dropping the big atomic bomb. It'll kill a lot of civilians. You could have starved out the Japanese and waited for them to surrender. It's an option. Who knows what these bombs are going to do exactly? And also this could lead to more global conflicts later. The problem with that last one is it's a little bit of hindsight in influencing it, but it's still a con. Strategic targets, right? We're only going to hit military targets. This will prevent the loss of American lives, right? So basically, the next step, if we don't drop the bombs, is, hey, Americans, it's time to invade Japan. And MacArthur wants to do that. MacArthur wants to invade Japan. He wants the glory. But the concern over how many Americans this will kill, early estimates would say hundreds of thousands, if not more, of Americans could potentially die. And more than that of Japanese people, right? Japanese are going to die that much and then more if the Americans were to invade mainland Japan, because they would probably fight to the death. To demonstrate the power of the American military to the Soviet Union is another reason. We want to show the Soviets, who are kind of making us a little nervous with all their aggression, hey, look what we got, right? So those are the pros and those are the cons. The bombs will be dropped in August of 1945. The Enola Gay will drop the bomb known as Little Boy, which is like the skinny one. And then and that's on Hiroshima. And then Japan still doesn't want to surrender. So they will drop another bomb on August 9th on Nagasaki. The Boxcar will drop the Fat Man, the bomb known as Fat Man, which is a big round one. These bombings will end conflict. Japan will surrender. They will unconditionally surrender right after the second bomb is dropped, which leads to VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day. Representatives of Emperor Hirohito will formally surrender to Douglas MacArthur on the USS Missouri. So that is the end of the Second World War militarily. So exit ticket time, guys. Our exit ticket is really simple and straightforward. It's just a couple of questions about this stuff. So identify and explain the turning points of the Allied war efforts in the Atlantic Theater specifically. Explain the strategy of island hopping in the Pacific. What's that? What's it mean? What's it do? And then give 3 examples and then explain how technological or strategic innovation, so it can be technology, it can be strategy. Strategy would be things like aircraft carriers, right? Or island hopping or blitzkrieg. Like, explain how they affected the Second World War. It doesn't matter which side you pick. So those are the 3 questions, really easy. We've only got a few minutes until lunch, about a minute left in class. I apologize for that. But if you have any questions, let me know, guys, and you are good to go. We will talk about the post-war times tomorrow. See you guys. Have a good one. If you have any questions, reach out to me on Teams.